My name's James Hewitt, James M. Hewitt, if you're writing it down, because it makes me more Googleable. I have been a professional tabletop game designer for about 2014 it started. So what's that? Nearly 7 years now, which is astonishing. I don't know how that's happened. But oh, here we go. Thank you, Dan. On browser, press to dock it, move it into the chat area. I think I can pin that. There we go. But yeah, I've been designing tabletop games for about 6-7 years full time. And on the screen before you see some of the games that I've worked on. So I designed Titanicus for Games Workshop, Necromunda, the 2016 edition, Hellboy, Devil May Cry, Gorchos and Silver Tower, Blitz Bowl, and Blood Bowl I sort of curated for a year and a bit, which, you know, it's a 20-odd-year-old rule set. I didn't design that, but I certainly ruined a few of the rules, which that's my personal claim to fame. But yeah, I've been working on a lot of games like this over the last few years, and miniatures really were the thing that got me into gaming. I was into Games Workshop miniatures games from a young age. Worked in Games Workshop retail stores for about 10 years, and graduate through Mantic Games, ended up working for Games Workshop, and left to set up Needy Cat Games in 2017. What do we do at Needy Cat though? Needy Cat, we make tabletop games for people who pay us to make tabletop games, and occasionally for ourselves, although that doesn't happen very often because it's nice when people pay you to do things. We also help people polish and refine their own games. So we have a service where if you have written a game and it needs a bit of extra work, we can come along and help you out with that. We run workshops and courses like this one you're doing right now. We also organise networking and social events for the tabletop games industry. I know a few people here are from the industry group. There was a breakfast meeting this morning. I didn't go because I was too busy. But yeah, we do like monthly or weekly weekly meetings, one in the morning, one in the evening. And it's a nice way for people in the industry to get together and hang out, share their worries. All of that will be linked in the email I send out after this. If you want to come along and join in, you're all welcome. And we produce a podcast about getting into the games industry, which I have very little to do with these days. Sophie, who's the other half of Needy Cat, finds guests, talks to them, edits it together, puts it out. It's called Finding Games, and it's well worth listening if you're looking to get into the tabletop games industry. So here's a big question. When it comes to the term miniature war games, what do we mean? I actually, I knew I wanted to do a course on, toy soldier games, however you want to refer to it, but I didn't quite know what to call it. So I went out to Twitter and asked Twitter and got 1,000,001 answers. But generally, what we said was, when we say today, when I say miniature war games, what I'm talking about is games where miniatures are the focus. It's generally like a war game or a conflict between two or more sides. It's theme and narrative driven. There are probably multiple asymmetrical factions, all with their own abilities and powers and miniatures ranges and things. Big one, there's a hobby element. So it's not just a single box that you buy. You're buying and collecting lots of different things and adding them all in. It's got a high level of player buy-in, which I'm sure any of you who are miniatures gamers will attest to. And there's kind of some degree of customization expected. It's almost like it's quite a DIY hobby. We're specifically not talking about chit and token war games like your old Avalon Hill type stuff, which is another way that war games gets used. We're not talking about board games that feature miniatures, which is another way that miniature games gets used. So like your Fantasy Flight, Descent, Imperial Assault, Mansions of Madness. Those are much more self-contained board games that just happen to use plastic miniatures. That said, a lot of what we're talking about here will apply to some of those things in different ways. Before I get properly started, the golden rule, the most important part, is there is no one right way to make a game. There's no right or wrong answers here, really. Not everything that I tell you will apply to every single miniatures game. And there are no magic bullets. There are no one-size-fits-all solutions when it comes to designing any kind of game, let alone miniatures games. All I can do is tell you kind of what's worked for us, what I've learned through several years of doing this stuff professionally. But really what you have to do is play more games, make more games, and just keep on doing that until you get better. It's the only way to do it. You had a question, one of the questions from Haggai Kovac, which was, as miniature war games are large and complex, where do you start? That's a fantastic question, isn't it? Where on earth do you start? In the chat, people that are watching live, how many of you have tried designing a miniatures war game in the past? Just let me know. If again, you don't have to. There's no mandatory audience participation, but if you have, let me know. I'm sure it's going to be a fair few people. I know on the survey responses we had quite a lot of people. Some people that have finished games, some people that have published games, some people that have attempted and failed. But where on earth do you start? It's such a massive, nebulous topic. These are not little self-contained card games. These are chunky projects with lots of moving parts. So where do you start? Designing any tabletop game, not just a miniatures war game, but any kind of tabletop game, has got a lot of challenges to it. I mean, we did a 6-part course just on the topic last year. But as well as the constraints that you find in there are loads more in miniatures war games. It's a crowded market. You've got the big players, you've got Games Workshop, and then everyone else a few steps below them. They're colossal these days. But even just with Games Workshop, it's a crowded market, let alone everyone else. And so you're trying to get your foot into there and find an audience. You can't go about this in a half-hearted way. I said half-hearted. I nearly said something else, but I'm keeping it clean. If you want your game to succeed, you've got to think it through. And part of that is considering what you want your game to be before you get started. So I've come up with a list of questions you should ask yourself about your war games project before you get started on it, before pen touches paper, before dice hit table. The first thing that you want to think about is, why are you designing a miniatures war game? What is it? What has led you to this point? Is it because you're trying to sell a particular range of miniatures? Like, you've got a miniatures range and you want to support that with a game, or someone else has got a miniatures range, they've asked you to help them support it? Is it to explore a setting or IP that you've got? Maybe, I don't know, maybe you're an author, or you've contacted an author and you want to write a game based in their world. Is it that you've never quite played the game that you want and you want to make that game? Is it that you've got some great ideas about mechanics and you want to put them to use? Do you just want to get your name in print? To be fair, for years, that was like my big thing. I just want to be a game designer. I don't care why. I just want to be a game designer. Is it just that you want to have a go at making games? Think about why you're doing it, because that is a great starting point. If your motivation is to sell a range of miniatures, then the decisions you make in the process of designing that game will be very different than if you just want to make something for the fun of it. So that's question number one. Question number two, who is it for? Who is your target audience? This is a big one, and this is one that a lot of first-time designers don't think of. Now, it's important whether you are doing this for commercial reasons, whether you're doing it just for yourself, whether you're doing it just to put it out online and just get your name out there. You've got to think of who it is you're trying to target with your game. Unless you're lucky enough to be, again, Games Workshop with a studio of 100 people, chances are you're not going to get the chance to make a game that caters to everyone. So pick your audience, find your lane, and work as hard as you can to do well in that lane. There's a few options here. Are you going for the die-hard wargaming fans, people that have played loads of games and want to try something new? Is it newcomers? It's straight away, those two different things there, you've got a very different approach. Your die-hard wargaming fans are going to want a very different game from you as opposed to your newcomers to the genre. Are you going for people that have only played like a couple of big brand games, like Games Workshop things? Are you just writing something for your friends or your gaming group, or just for yourself? All of those are equally valid, but you need to know in your heart who your game is for. I talk a lot when it comes to game design about constraints. Constraints are things which limit your creativity, and they're really useful. I really like constraints because a blank page is a scary thing when you're doing anything creative. So having, some things which are your hard and fast yes and no's laid out at the start can be really helpful. First one is digital or print. There's a little asterisk next to print, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So do you want your game to be available online or in a book? Do you want it to be expandable and forward compatible? The answer generally for miniature war games is you want it to be expandable because, you want to be able to expand that game. Very few miniature war games are like a single self-contained kit. There's usually additional expansions and supplements and armies. What's your budget for art and layout? If you don't know the answer, if the budget is whatever I can get together, that's fine. Write that down. Are you just doing a rulebook or accessories as well? One of the big things you see in indie tabletop war games is games just a PDF. But then when you start going to the more expensive end, you start seeing custom components, decks of cards. As a player, what are they having to buy to play the game? And then how are you going to produce all of that? How many factions do you want to have? Are you starting small? Are you jumping off the deep end? And if you said print, good news, you've got a whole load of other stuff to think about. I shan't read all of this out. I'll let you take in the horror. Just believe me when I say that print production is a whole beast unto itself. And I used to have hair, and I don't even do it generally. I generally just work with companies that handle that stuff. It's just the knowledge of it has, frankly, taken years off my life. You don't. Yeah, you really realize you're in the games industry when you realize you're not just worrying about designing games, you're worrying about how you're going to store the games you've made, because that's costing a load of money. Your distributors closing, so you've got to find a new one. You've got to move all your stuff from warehouse to warehouse. 1,000 books have gone missing. Print production is, as I say, it's a terrifying thing. So if you do that, you've got to be pretty serious about stuff. Back on topic though. Which miniatures do you want to do? I asked this question on Twitter yesterday or the day before, I think, to try to. I think I worded it quite badly, but I was trying to get some data so I could do a slide in here. A lot of people have used the term miniatures agnostic to refer to games. So games which don't have a particular miniatures range. I then invented the term miniatures fundamentalist for something like Malifaux or Age of Sigmar, where the miniatures really, really do matter to the game. So it's basically the question is, are you trying to drive the sales of a particular miniatures range? So what you have only rules in your game which correspond to specific miniatures that you or a sister company sells. Or, if you do that, you have to cater for your players' every need because you're kind of training them to only use stuff that you sell. Or do you want to kind of go the other way and go like, Oathmark, Frostgrave, Open Combat, encourage people to create their own things and use whichever miniatures they like? Just think about whereabouts you are. I've got a little spectrum here, and don't focus too carefully on the exact order things are on there, because we could be arguing about it all night. I might drop this on Twitter later and let people debate it. But basically, think about if this is a spectrum of war games and how miniatures agnostic they are. Whereabouts would your game go on that scale? As it says there, it's not about WYSIWYG or competitive play rules. WYSIWYG being what you see is what you get. In other words, if the model has got a gun and a sword, you have to have in the rule that it has a gun and a sword. It's not about that. This is about, from a design intent point of view, are you trying to sell particular miniatures to go with your game? So yeah, think about whereabouts on that scale your game would fit. And then here's a very important one. How big is your game? What scale are you writing for? Are you going for sort of the 25 to 30 millimeter, general standard thing you see for a lot of tabletop games these days? If you do that, you're going to immediately have a load of compatible miniatures and scenery out there. How big's your recommended table size? There's an increasing fashion these days for games that fit on small tables. Relic Blade, Open Combat. My brain's going numb, but there are multiple games that fit on like a 2x2 or a 3x3 foot area. And yeah, are you going to do that? How many models, units per side? Whatever you do, you're going to give a different feel to your game. Something like Warmaster, which is the classic Games Workshop game of, I think, 5mm scale models on a 6x4 table. That is huge, sweeping strategic battle. You've got massive monsters and huge arrays of troops. Very different to something like Necromunda, where you've got 28mm models, maybe a dozen aside. What you decide here will determine how much detail you include. I'm going to come back to that in quite a big way later when we talk about abstraction. I think the last couple of questions here are possibly the most important, although really they're all as important as each other. How, will I hear about your game? How will the average person find out about your game? How will your game find its player base? Have you already got a following? Are you on social media? Do you run a gaming club or a campaign group or something? If not, how are you going to make one? how will your game stand out and grab people's attention? Because the fact is that player bases do not create themselves. If I go to a gaming club or a shop or somewhere, I don't know, the sound of that sounds mad at the moment, but in 6 months' time or 2 years ago, whatever it would be, if I went to a gaming club and I wanted to get a pick up and play game in, so I just want to turn up and play a game, my options are I could take 1,500 points of Warhammer 40,000, or I could take, pick any other small indie game. Which one of those is likely to get me a game? Which one is worth me bringing along? It's going to be the game that's got a big established player base. So what it means is that if you're creating a small miniatures game, you have to foster a community. And generally what that means is you're having to recruit ambassadors for your game. Not necessarily an official recruitment process, but you have to make your game so cool and so unique that people will go, I have to get my friends playing this. This is cool. So you're convincing them, and then they're convincing their friends to go and buy in on your game and play it for, let's face it, you're going to get 3 or 4 months generally, and then they'll butterfly away and play X-Wing or something. This is what normally happens. But that community has to happen. You have to have something which stands out and convinces your ambassadors and lets them convince their friends. So how are you going to do that? And then finally, how do you maintain that player base? As I say, games that people pick up that aren't their like main game they play tend to have, about a 3-month lifespan on the table, and they'll come back to it usually. But you have to give them a reason to come back to it. It's a bit of a reach to expect people to just play your game and nothing else, because there's so much out there. But what you ideally want is you want people to come back to your game regularly. So they'll play it for 3 months, go play something else, and then come back, twice a year maybe, and play your game. But how are you going to maintain that interest? When you look at something like, Games Workshop, Mantic, until recently Steamforge, various companies that have miniatures-based games, they put out new content for those on a regular or semi-regular basis, and that keeps the players interested. It shakes up the meta. I'll talk about meta later. It's a weird word. I don't particularly like the word meta, but you have to acknowledge it. But yeah, you have to kind of be able to expand outwards, and you have to think about how sustainable that's going to be for you. If you're a small company, a single person designing this, how can you guarantee you're going to have the time to write, develop, test, and release something new every 6 months? Because I think that's like your bare minimum, really, is once every 6 months. One of the options is to release something that, strip down your core game and put some of the elements you wrote for that as expansions, but that's a risky one because it can feel like people are getting a stripped down core product, and they don't necessarily like that. I've certainly had a few games where I felt a bit cheated. And yeah, finally, what's your backup plan? If you can't do that, what are you going to do? You're going to get someone else to do it for you? Are you going to let your game fizzle away and die, which I've seen happen to far too many cool games? So when you come to a project, think of all that stuff. There's a lot of it there, but go through and try to answer as many of those questions as you can. Conveniently, that gives you a design brief. Design brief is a term like business plan that sounds really scary until you actually sit down and do it. It hasn't got to be fancy. It hasn't got to be some big official document. It just has to be a written record of your answer to all those questions. Because what it is a targeting guide. That design brief, the answers to those questions will tell you the kind of game you're making. And throughout your design process, it's a working document. You'll go back to it and you'll look at, where your game is and compare it to all of those things and find out if you're still on target. And if you're not, you can change it. You can absolutely, you don't have to stick to the brief slavishly. But having the brief means that you'll make those changes consciously. You won't just drift off and realize, oh no, I'm making a game that will never sell. You will make that game that is devoted to your target audience. And if you decide to change that, then that's a decision that you make. So in summary, on that point, if you can't answer those questions, especially the last two about building and maintaining a customer base, you're going to have trouble. As I said earlier, it's a big, crowded market. So you need to think about how you're going to stand out. And that brief is going to help you remain conscious of all those factors. One of my favorite things about miniatures wargames is the hobby side of it. It's, the building, painting, collecting, the community around it. I think that is one of the coolest parts. And considering, technically you'd think I'd be really excited about the rules bit, but I accept that for what it is. The really cool part is the people you meet along the way and the cool artsy things you get to do with it. So yeah, let's start off with a question here. Got a question from Matt Forehand saying, can I talk about the value of player agency in miniature war games? So building, listing, painting, the hobby. I assume they always help, but how critical are they? So thanks, Matt, for that one. It's a big one. As I say, miniature war games, they're more than just a game, they're a hobby. It's like a lifestyle. You're selling a lifestyle. And I think anyone who is a miniatures war gamer can attest to this. I'm sure most of you in this room will, that they in Games Workshop they refer to it as the hobby gene. People have the hobby gene, meaning that they can be sold to. But basically, yeah, what this is a double-edged sword. It's a thing. Hobby games, miniatures games have a really high barrier to entry. They require a lot of buy-in from the player, and so they can be a bit alienating to people who just want a casual game to play. On the other hand, once you get people who have kind of already passed that barrier, you've got existing war gamers, or you manage to pull people across that barrier, you get a great audience. You get people who are dedicated, who are loyal, who will write their own rules for your stuff. They'll play test and proofread your things for you. It's a fantastic element to look at. Now, for anyone who hasn't, maybe been into war games as much, I know when I did the survey, there are a few people that aren't war gamers themselves. Let's just do a little side-by-side comparison. So board games, we work with a lot of board games. As you see, I've got a lot of board games behind me. The average board game, I've got Pandemic there, which if you haven't played it, fantastic game, a little bit on the nose at the minute, but still really good. To get started with it, you buy the game, take it home, punch the components out, learn the rules by reading the rules or watching how to play video. And normally the rule book's about 20 pages. Set it up and play it. And then at the end of it, you put it all away and it goes back on the shelf exactly as it was. Originally, my next slide was comically long, but I split it. I was trying to labour the point. I don't need to labour the point. A lot of you will know this. Getting started with a miniatures war game is so much more involved than that. Step one, there isn't normally just one product you can buy. If you're lucky, I do apologize, Dan. If you're lucky, there's a starter box, which has got maybe some models, some rules, some accessories, whatever else. That might be a cut down force there. You might need to buy some more models to go along with it. You might need to buy some additional miniatures and accessories and whatever else. But whatever the case, you get that stuff, you get it home. You don't have to build and paint your models. Maybe the painting you'll leave off till now. We all tell ourselves we'll paint stuff before we play with it, but let's be honest, you're gonna leave it for a bit. So you've got to assemble your miniatures, and that is a thing that if you're brand new to this, how on earth do you assemble miniatures? How do you paint miniatures? Thankfully, these days there's a whole load of great guidance online, but still, it's a little thing. It's a brick in that wall, that barrier to entry. Then you learn the rules or watch a how to play video, just like with board games, except that normally with war games, that rulebook isn't 20 pages, is it? It's it's a bit of a weighty tome. I remember running beginners lessons in Games Workshop for Warhammer and watching kids' faces fall as I showed them the 300-page book. I was like, oh, it's all right. Only the first third of it is rules. And yeah, war games tend to be quite complex and quite granular. So there's that step takes a bit longer. Not only that, though, you're not just learning the rules for the game, you're also learning all the special rules for your faction, because most factions tend to have their own individual rules that are a bit different to the other ones. You've then got to find another player who's done the same, either a community, you're going to a wargaming club or a group, or you're dragging your friends through this as well. If you're lucky, you might have someone else who's already done it, can pull you along. Then you've got to find a table and some terrain. Again, maybe you've got a gaming club that's already got that stuff, but if not, you're on the dining table, you're trying to make it fix. It's only 5 foot by 3 foot rather than 6 foot by 4 foot. You're laying down a blanket that's slightly the wrong color. You've got a few coffee mugs as terrain pieces. Then you choose a scenario. Going back to Pandemic, whenever you play Pandemic, it looks like that. When you play, I don't know, Saga or Infinity, there are multiple different scenarios to choose from. Which one do you do? Some games have a beginner scenario. They don't all, though. Then you have to set the game up following some probably quite Byzantine instructions and then play the game. And then at the end of it all, you have to put it all away. It's much more of a laborious thing because there's so many, you've got dead piles and dice everywhere. Basically, my point is, getting started with a miniatures war game it's not a quick process. And also, yeah, as I said a minute ago, war games tend to look really complex. There's loads of jargon. The average person in this life doesn't generally know what a D6 is or what line of sight is. Don't put it away. Promise yourself you'll paint it soon. Do not look at the shelf behind me. There's nothing to see on there. There's all these skills to learn. And also, I've got to say, some parts of the online community are incredibly helpful. Some other parts are really horrible to new people. Some of the, places you'll find people talking about war games, I imagine a lot of new players would look at that and go, oh, no, this isn't for me, and walk away. So yeah, there are a lot of barriers you have to kind of pull your players across. And it's really easy to forget that if you've been doing this for a while. If you're someone who's been playing these games for a long time, here's the answers to the survey that I sent out. Over 60% of people who've been playing the games for more than a decade, and the other about half of what's left, or slightly over half of what's left, have been playing for at least 5 years. So the majority of people who are designing these games, we went through that journey a long time ago. So to us, it doesn't seem like it's as much of a big deal. But believe me, those years I spent in the shops, teaching people how to play games and seeing the wide-eyed wonder as they walk in off the street for the first time and, think, what on earth is all this? It is a whole different world. And as a designer, it is your responsibility to guide your players through that. And if you don't bear that in mind, well, you're going to miss out on some players, basically. So in summary, bear in mind that all of that can deter people from your game. You're not just selling a game, you're selling a lifestyle. Existing wargamers are a great source of new players for your game because they've already got all the stuff. But also, actually, the other side of the hobby element, which I didn't really cover there, but it's worth mentioning briefly. The benefit of it is that a lot of people can be pulled into the game that wouldn't play it otherwise by the collecting and painting and hobby element. I know loads of people who play the games who started out by going, oh, I'll paint an elf. Why not? And then before you know it, they've got an army, and then they want to do something with it because, well, if you've spent all that money and painted and spent all that time painting it, you feel like you should do something with it, right? When you learn the game. And yeah, that high buy-in, once people get past it, does make them nice and dedicated. Consider your target audience. I can't say that enough. It's really, really important to make sure you know who your audience is. Let's talk then about simulation and abstraction. Another question came in here, which is quite relevant here. James Farrell asked, how do you strike a good balance between realism and fluid gameplay? For example, in rules for things like cover, fighting, etc., how do you keep things abstract enough to be free-moving, fast and fun, without making them feel too light? It's a fantastic question, and I've got a great example for you. I'm sure some of you will have heard of this. So war games rely heavily on their theme. They are generally games which are very theme-driven, they're very narrative-heavy, and so they need to use mechanics that simulate narrative events. In other words, when something happens in the narrative of the game, the rules need to reflect that. When a unit moves through terrain that is boggy, it should feel as though they're being slowed down in some way. However, if you simulate everything, you get the campaign for North Africa. You can see it in the background there. It's a game from 1978 by a designer called Richard Berg, allegedly written as a joke, but put a lot of work into it considering it's a joke. It's famously, it has about 1,600 tokens and things in it. The board is roughly the size of Africa, and I believe to play the average game length, if you were to play it once a week for 3 hours, it would take about 10 years. So it's ridiculous. It's utterly nonsense, and it has all sorts of rules. You're tracking rations on individual units across the whole of North Africa. You can imagine it's an exercise in paperwork, but it stands to prove a point. That is simulation taken to a ridiculous extreme. You do not want that to happen. So how do you decide which parts of your game need to be abstracted? quick little rule of thumb to help you kind of visualize the difference between simulation and abstraction, because I've spoken to some people who struggle to get the difference. On the left there, we have a controller, a flight stick controller for like a PC flight sim game. You've got maybe 24 buttons, various different axes of movement and different things. So if you're playing a game where you need to very realistically model all of the elements of flying an airplane, that's the controller you need. And if that's the sort of thing you enjoy, fantastic. You will get a lot of time out of that. If you're someone who wants to play a game like an arcade dogfighting game, you do not need that many buttons. And if your game has that many controls, it's going to really bog down your experience. So maybe the Xbox controller is a little bit more suitable. You know, maybe you've got one button for engine go quicker, one button for machine guns go fire, and then you can move around with the joysticks. Neither one of those is better. I want to make that very clear from the start. They each have their place. They're both individual tools that you need to use, and especially in war games, you need to find a balance between those two. I know that when I play a flight video game, I'm rubbish at flight sims. I like my games that have a little bit of a vaguely realistic feel to them, but generally I want to be waving an Xbox controller around and just focusing on shooting down some enemy planes. So why is simulation useful? Simulation is a rule that describes the narrative and sells the theme. What I mean by that is, as I said, if that unit is going through terrain, then their movement is slowed. That gives you it captures your imagination. It brings those miniatures to life. It lets you imagine those miniatures, those little representations, marching across the battlefield through the bog. You know, when they throw themselves into cover and they are then harder for the enemy to hit. It brings that story to life. It makes it cinematic. It can make rules more intuitive. There's a limit to it, but it can certainly help. Basically, when a rule is like simulationist, maybe, it's often easier for a player to understand. For example, that movement rule where you slow down going through a bog. Of course you do, because it's a bog. You're going to slow down, aren't you? So that's the sort of thing where a player can understand that, and it helps them learn the rule easier. It can also make the rules feel more crunchy. By crunchy, it's a highly technical term. It makes the rules feel more granular, more impactful. There is more of a feel of the players can engage with the game, and things will do what they expect. You know, when their unit of big gun troops opens fire on the enemy, they will, if there's a simulationist rules effect in place, it will feel like a bunch of troops with big guns opening fire on the enemy. So that's all good, but too much simulation, as I said before, with North Africa, Campaign for North Africa, it slows the game down. Also, if every element of your game is based on a simulation of the narrative, the game can be a real mess, because, you know, real life is messy and narratives tend to be messy. And it means you end up with like 10 different rules for different ways that troops go through rations or something, you know, which just makes the game untidy. And as I said, it can make the rules easier to learn, but it can also make them harder to remember if they're all different. So abstraction, as I've kind of hinted quite heavily, is utterly vital. Abstracting things lets you kind of skip past the boring or laborious parts. You don't need to know in a game of Warhammer 40,000 how many rounds each trooper has got left in their gun. You just assume they've got enough ammunition to last them for the entire battle. It lets you use rules that might not make sense narratively, but they make the game work better. If your only consideration is realism or trying to match the narrative, you will put in rules which are clunky because they make sense. By giving yourself permission to abstract things, you get past that and you focus more on, you know, the things that matter, the gameplay experience, the flow of the game. Also lets you be deliberately vague and fudge things. If you don't want people to know exactly, you know, if you say you've got a made-up setting, you don't want people to know exactly how many rounds the sci-fi missile launcher carries in its magazine, because you haven't thought of it. And, you know, let's face it, if you put an actual hard value on it, people will tell you you're wrong. you can be vague by just saying, oh, it's got enough ammo for the entire game. It's all good. Or you roll a dice to see it runs out of ammo. The vague brush is a very handy thing to use in game design. But on the other hand, you can't abstract everything, because the more stuff you abstract, the more your rules will feel woolly and unsatisfying to play. They'll feel like there's a lot of slippage between what the players want to do and what they're envisioning in their heads and what's happening on the battlefield. I'm going to go into some examples of abstraction, but yeah, have a think about when you get there are games that you've played that have had a lot of abstraction in them. Has it felt as satisfying as playing a really crunchy game with lots of detail? But have you played a game that's got too much detail and takes far too long to play? Warhammer 40,000 second edition, looking at you. So I'm going to look at 3 levels of abstraction. I'm going to use Games Workshop for a lot of references because 2 reasons. First of all, well, 3 reasons. It's ubiquitous. Everyone is generally fairly aware of it. Going by the survey that you answered, the majority of you have played at least a Games Workshop game. And also, as I say, I've worked for them. I've grown up with them, so I know them pretty well myself. So I'm going to look at 3 different levels of abstraction in 3 different GW sci-fi games. These are all games that have a broadly similar playtime and table size. They're all games that play on, a 4x4 to 6x4 table. They take about an hour to an hour and a half maybe to get through a game, with some fluctuation up and down for individual things. But they're all kind of broadly comparable in that regard. They're set in the same universe, a lot of the same weapons, character types and things, but they focus on different things and they aim to deliver different play experiences. First of all, Blast from the Past. Who remembers Inquisitor? I think this game came out when I was about 16. And it was a classic. These days, generally played at 28mm scale, using loads of homebrew rules, but was designed for 54mm, big miniatures, which were beautiful. And it was as close as Games Workshop came to like a role-playing game at the time, really. It was each player had a warband of 3 to 5 miniatures, and the whole point of the game was telling cool stories and having cinematic set-piece battles. There was no inkling of any kind of balance or competitiveness to it. There were, I think, attempts later on to add in like points values and things, but clearly the design intent was not that. It even in places encouraged the use of a games master to referee the game. The rules are probably as granular and detailed as anything that Games Workshop has ever produced. And it's a cracking game. I loved it. Full of flaws, but the audacity of it, I adored. So that's Inquisitor. That's our kind of furthest towards the simulation end of rules design. In the middle, I know this one, Necromunda. I'm talking about the 2016 edition, but this applies to pretty much any Necromunda you like, really. I'm just using this one because it's the one that I designed myself in the first place. Although it's had lots of development since then for people that aren't me. This is back to more GW standard 28mm figures, and each player is controlling a gang of 12 to 15-ish models. Necromunda is primarily intended as a vehicle for campaign games, so it's intended that players will take on a gang and see it through a series of linked battles where, they'll progress, they'll gain new skills, they'll lose limbs. Balance is a consideration, like more than it is an Inquisitor, but this is not a balanced competitive game. It is much more about kind of cool stories, but because there are more miniatures on the table, it's more abstracted than Inquisitor is. The rules are fairly detailed, but not as much as Inquisitor. The obvious next choice is Warhammer 40,000, which is, for anyone that doesn't know, designed for 28mm models with an army aside. So, I don't know, 30, 40, 50, 100 models per side. And the current edition of Warhammer 40,000, 9th edition, is very much designed with one purpose in mind, and that is to let people play quick, easy games with a large collection of miniatures. And it's intended to be used as well in competitive balanced play. So that's the only game out of those 3 that has had like balance and competitiveness as a key factor in the design process. As a result, the rules are pretty streamlined. So let's have a look at how those 3 games all handle something that they all do lots of, ranged attacks, shooting stuff. Got a table. Who loves a table, right? We're game designers. We like tables. Oh, sorry, that was probably a horrible noise. So yeah, in Inquisitor, thank you, Jonathan. In Inquisitor, when you make a shooting attack, there are lots of hit modifiers. So you're making a hit roll, and that roll is modified by a whole bunch of factors. You're looking at, has the model moved this turn? Are they resting their gun on a ledge or similar, platform? Are they prone? There are multiple different range bands for weapons. There's all sorts of stuff there. In Necromunda, you've got 2 or 3 modifiers. You've got long range, short range, cover. That's about it, I think. Warhammer 40,000, you don't have general in the core rules like to hit modifiers for things like movement and range and stuff, unless I'm going mad and I've forgotten them. But yeah, basically that isn't in there. So you can see 3 levels of abstraction. In Necromunda, you're abstracting away a lot of the detail, and the rest of it goes by the time you hit 40k. Similarly, pinning, the idea that when bullets start flying, people put their heads down. That's in Inquisitor and Necromunda, but has no place in 40k because it's going to slow things down. It doesn't really matter if 1 or 2 of the members in the squad duck into cover when bullets start flying, because the game is based on its squad level combat. It doesn't really matter. One of the best ways to show this abstraction is in what you target with an attack. In Inquisitor, you might hit someone's left leg, you might hit their head. The always hilarious groin. In Necromunda, you hit a model, and in 40k you hit a squad or a unit, vehicle, whatever it is. It's just a blob, basically. You're not hitting individual people. That then carries through into possible outcomes. So in Inquisitor, you've got multiple levels of injury, you've got bleeding, you've got stun, you've got multiple types of armor on each location. Necromunda is a bit more streamlined. Models can be standing up, they can be knocked down, they can be out of play. And in 40k, they just, once they've lost all their wounds, they're gone. And finally, ammunition. Inquisitor, you're literally like in arrows in D&D, you're marking down. I've got 5 shots left, 4 shots left. Necromunda, there's a roll which abstracts it. And in 40k, as I said earlier, you just assume that the characters have got enough ammunition to last for the entire battle. So those things have all got kind of, they're all like that for a reason. Each of these games has the right level of abstraction based on the type of game it's trying to play. With Inquisitor, all that detail that's in there makes the game feel really detailed and crunchy. But if you tried tracking all of that, even in Necromunda with 12 models aside, the game would take forever. And the more models you add, the more exponentially that increases. It's something that slows games down a lot. And if you look at the evolution of Warhammer 40,000 from Rogue Trader back in the 80s to 9th edition now, it is a constant process of refinement and streamlining and abstraction. And there are probably a few things that have gone the other way over the years, back and forth. But generally, the game has been distilled down to the point where now you can play a really sizable game in really not much time at all. And you lose a lot of detail. You look at the jump from 7th edition to 8th edition, when vehicles kind of stopped having loads of their own individual rules and just became a big trooper with loads of wounds. You've got all these abstractions that have come in, and they might have caused outcry when they happened, but actually they have sped that game up. And because the design intent of that game is to be played quickly, that's worked out. So what should you abstract in your own games? There are no hard and fast answers. Like I said at the start, there are no right and wrong answers, unfortunately. All you can do is find the elements that are dull or which slow down your game and get rid of them, or abstract them at least. You find that out through playtesting. I'll talk about playtesting a little bit later. Also, you should simulate specifically the elements that really sell your game's theme or showcase that thing that makes it unique. I said earlier, you want your game to stand out as unique. Well, you need to find what those elements are and make sure those are kind of the bits that you simulate and really focus on. Again, playtesting and player feedback are the way forward. There will be things that slow your game down, but also really sell the theme. And that's where you kind of have to make a judgment call. And the easiest way to kind of test it is to play the game both with those things as a simulated thing, and then play the game with them abstracted. And you have to kind of be open-minded and be willing to accept that they need to go. Be willing to murder your darlings, as the saying goes. And yeah, if you're willing to do that, you will find 9 times out of 10 that can be abstracted and it doesn't really affect the gameplay. The myth of balance. Here we go. This is the one that I'm waiting to be taken out of context and posted on Better Lost Souls or something in a scathing takedown of my character. Balance. Let's talk about balance. Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yep, just yep, print screen, crop, get it into paint. Question here from Tonio. What are the best ways to create balance in a game that has many factions, mechanics that are unique and divergent in play style? It's a fantastic question. My goodness, balance in tabletop games it's such a big topic. It's a thing that has haunted me for years. People that have played games that I've written probably have opinions on how good I am at balancing things. I know I have opinions about how good I am at balancing things. But let's talk about it. As far as I'm concerned, game balance, especially and specifically in terms of narrative heavy, like miniatures, war games, that sort of thing, it's not as important as you might think. And a lot of people worry far too much about it. It's not something you can ignore. Don't take this as me saying, anarchy rules, do what you like. Balance is important. Fairness is important. But getting really, really good balance takes a lot of time. And sometimes that time is better spent elsewhere. As it says there are some controversial dark secrets in this section. I think there are things that a lot of designers might not admit to, but I think it's the unspoken dark secret of game design, a lot of this. So I'm letting you through the looking glass here. Do with this information what you will. Balance is a time sink. Fine-tuning your game's balance can and will devour all of your time on a project. The law of diminishing returns is very much in effect. What I've got over there is a graph showing like development over time. And if you could represent balance as a percentage, then you can see, let me just get my pointer in place. Here's like your 100% perfect game. Let's be honest, the 100% is going to be about there, I think, for the average miniatures game. You're never going to quite reach it. But whatever the case, this is like as balanced as it can be. And this is your time spent testing. Let's see. I should have put like some units on this graph. But let's say each one of these is like, I don't know, a unit of testing time, a week of testing, whatever it might be. In the time it takes you to get from, 10% balanced to 50% balanced. Let's call that 1 unit of time. The next unit of time, you might get from 50 to 70, and then from 70 to 80, 80 to 85, 85 to 87, 87 to 88. And it really starts leveling off because the development process, you will start with bigger changes and you'll get increasingly fine. It's like, sanding a block of wood. You start with the coarse sandpaper and you gradually get finer and finer. But by the end, you're testing maybe, 3 or 4 weeks before you get to the point of actually making a significant change. So the question is, where on that graph do you stop? How much balance is enough balance? The key point is, I don't think it's up here. And I don't think it's probably even about here. I think your sweet spot for balance is, let me just get the pen. I think it's probably somewhere around this sort of area here. That is where the average miniatures war game, I think, roughly is. I would say that's where the Games Workshop games you know, the big players. I think that's roughly where they live. And actually, that's fine. Here's why it's not such a big issue, and we'll get into it. What's lovely, because I have no direct feedback from you, I can just imagine you're all sat there in stunned silence as I drop these truth bombs on you. I'm pretty certain it's not actually as dramatic as I'm making out. But yeah, key point is, when it comes to war games, there are many different reasons why people play them. Some people want a challenge, you know, strategic, tactical, whatever it might be. Some people want to tell stories. Some people want to solve interesting puzzles. Some people want to hang out with their friends, engage in the hobby, show off their collection. There's all sorts of different reasons. And actually, balance doesn't affect most of those. It certainly affects whether some things are challenge, and if there are puzzles to be solved, they're probably a balance thing. But do you know what has to worry about balance an awful lot more than miniatures war games? Eurogames. I love Eurogames. For those that don't know, Eurogames are a subgenre of board games, and it's an increasingly muddy and irrelevant term, really. It's something which has changed. There's debates over, you know, which games are and aren't Eurogames. But generally, a Eurogame is a game where theme is a bit less important. It's often a crutch to help people get into the game, and once you're actually in it, you stop worrying about what the theme is. You're just looking at the different parts of the board. They're often quite abstract. Randomness is more often than not quite rare, by which I mean you don't see a lot of randomness. What you do see is often input randomness only. The difference between input and output randomness. Input randomness is something where something is randomized, and then players make decisions off what that is. So, for example, some cards are drawn from a deck, and then players choose one of those cards each or something. Output randomness is what you more often see in miniatures games, where like you make a decision and then you roll the dice to see what the outcome is, or you randomize to see what the outcome is. So you choose a target, roll to hit, and you see how well you do. So generally, you're seeing the input randomness in these kind of games, where the game state is randomized and then players make decisions. It's usually competition between players. You're racing towards a common goal. You're trying to get the most points, but you're not generally directly in conflict with each other. There are often lots of opportunities to annoy each other and get in each other's way, but it's not like you're directly fighting. You're kind of working in parallel. And also, as it says at the end it's unlikely to be explosions or players feeling the need to make sound effects, which I think is just a shame, really. I think more games need sound effects. But Eurogames, as you can imagine, because of all of those elements, balance is a lot more important, because, you know, it's going to matter a lot more. But you haven't got the hobby element. You haven't got the story to kind of mask those balance issues. Question from Donnie there. I will come back to that question at the end of this topic. Also, abstract strategy games, things like, you know, chess, Go, Yinch, which is a fantastic game, which is shown here. These are games which are basically the theme is non-existent, or is there as like a, you know, it's there in name only. It's a puzzle to be solved. You've often got perfect information or no random element at all. And it's usually players directly matching wits with each other. To be clear, abstract strategy games is a massively broad category. It's even more so than Euro games, and it's hard to define. But you get the idea. These are games where, again, you don't have those kind of helpful elements that we have in miniatures war games that, you know, help you get around the balance issue. If a game hasn't got much randomness, you can solve it. I do use that term loosely. You know, you get things which are, well, that is a good play, that is a bad play, that's a good strategy, that's a bad strategy. And then it becomes less about you know, being good at a game on the fly. It becomes more about memorizing good moves. The more balanced the game is as well, the more balanced the game is, the harder it is to get to that solved state, because it's hard to say this is definitely better than that. Once the game has been solved, players will stop playing it. So balance really, really, really matters in games like this. But this is not a talk about designing Euro games and abstract strategy games. Here is a graph, or I don't know, it's not a graph, is it? It's like a pictogram. It's been a while. Here's a graphic a graphic which is a good little a rule of thumb, if you like. It's got two axes. The top to bottom one is games with lots of randomness at the top, games with low randomness at the bottom, and predictable and self-contained versus unpredictable and ever expanding. Predictable self-contained, what I mean by that is a game which is like Pandemic we saw earlier, that is predictable and self-contained. You as the designer know exactly what all the components are because it's not expandable. I mean, there are expansions, but that's a separate issue for later. The point is that core game is a complete game. On the other hand, you've got war games where the core game is the starting point, and then from there, people will add all sorts of extra things in. You're going to have to constantly make up new rules, new units. It's impossible to predict how things are going to balance against other things. So, if your game is up in the top right-hand corner, like war games are, you don't need to get too hung up on balance because A, it's hard to do, and B, it's hard to judge. But as I said, down in this bottom left-hand corner with those games like we just looked at, you do need to make sure your balance is definitely on point. Also, here's a top tip for you. Imbalance actually helps you with war games because, well, for a start, it's a given. People just expect war games to have balance issues. People expect there to be units that are more or less powerful than others. Whenever, a new product comes out for a war game, the internet forums will immediately light up with people saying, oh, here's the new things. This is rubbish. This is great. Adding this to my army, that can go and die in a hole somewhere. These balance issues exist, and that's fine. Because if your game is a perfectly balanced ecosystem, how on earth do you add anything new to it? And as we said before, miniatures war games, they live on constant refreshment, on new things coming out. If your game's not balanced, and the next thing you bring out redresses that balance in some way, if in your fantasy war game, if magic is underpowered, and so no one's really using magic, then you bring in a new faction that uses loads of magic. Oh wow! Suddenly now magic's really cool. People are going to want to go and buy the stuff that does magic, and it kind of feels like a dark, evil marketing art. But actually, it's healthy game design. It's keeping that game's ecosystem alive. So don't worry too much about this. This is what the meta is. When people talk about the meta, the meta game, this is talking about how are the players engaging with the game? What things are they using? What things are they avoiding? And you as a designer, if you've got an ongoing miniatures game, you look at that information and you think, right, what do I need to do? What do I need to change? What do I need to add? What can I bring in? And that is all stuff that you can do. And so worrying about every single little thing being balanced is kind of a waste of time. But here's the big caveat. Your game needs to not be perceived as obviously broken, or no one will want to play it. What I always tell people is don't aim for balance, don't aim for perfect balance, aim for perceived fairness, and aim for your game to not obviously be broken. Because that is vital. The fundamentals of your game need to be balanced. If two people of roughly equal skill sit down to play a roughly, a standard scenario, that outcome needs to be in doubt. If player A and their army always beats player B, if they're roughly the same skill level, then your game isn't balanced and they're not going to enjoy it. If a more skilled player takes on a less skilled player, then they should have the more chance of winning, but the less skilled player should always have, a chance of getting the advantage through luck or through random happenstance. But yeah, the key thing is, as designers of tabletop war games, you don't need to lose sleep worrying that not every single war gear item is 100% balanced. Because also, there's no way you will balance it. You could test your game hundreds of times, thousands of times. The moment it gets into your players' hands, they will immediately do something you'd never would have thought of and invalidate the entire testing process. I mean, this was a nightmare when I was working for Games Workshop because we would test internally and we'd get a few hundred games played. Sure, on day one, 20,000 people, whatever it is, get their hands on the rules, and immediately the internet is awash with this is broken, this is great, that's terrible, and you have to just accept it. But it's fine because it's all part of the process. Now, some people might be saying, but I want my miniatures game to have a thriving competitive scene. And here's like harsh truth o'clock. A thriving competitive scene is really, really hard to do. Games with like thriving active competitive scenes, off the top of my head, there's the Games Workshop games, Magic the Gathering, Netrunner had it, but it's a dead game now. Yu-Gi-Oh, maybe Pokemon still. You know, a couple of the fantasy flight like X-Wing, Armada, maybe. There aren't many. There are probably less than a dozen games with an active competitive scene, to the point where it's actually driving sales and keeping that game afloat. And this is because competitive play really relies on a large, enthusiastic community. I've seen games which are otherwise really successful games, which support a large miniatures range, but their national tournaments have 12 people, and those 12 people, even if they buy an army each a year, that's not going to keep a miniatures game afloat. So you need a large community that wants to keep on playing competitively. You need a matching online presence with people playing the game, discussing it, third parties other than yourself talking about the game, blogging about it, making videos, analyzing things, because that will draw people in. You need a broad range of miniatures and factions, because a lot of the draw of competitive play is finding interesting combinations and loopholes. And you need constant new releases. Earlier on, when I said about 6 months is your minimum, that's not going to cut it for competitive play. You're looking at kind of every couple of months, really. You want something new coming out, because otherwise people will get tired of it. All of that is stuff you need to think about before you even consider the idea of balance. Because if you can't do that stuff, there is no point wasting your time making the most balanced game that no one's going to play. It sounds horrible to say it, but like, I would not want to put the energy in myself personally to do that, because I think you need a large team to pull off competitive play. I would love to be proven wrong. So please, if you've got some ideas of games that have done it, let me know. So yeah, how do you balance your game? Is a big question, isn't it? I've told you all about it, but how do you do it? Short answer is playtesting. As I've said before, the more of it you do, the more balanced your game will be. But of course, there is that law of diminishing returns. Don't do too much. I mean, no, keep going. Too much is a difficult thing to understand, really, with playtesting, because you can never have too much. But really, you reach a point where you just need to release your game. We go into quite a lot of detail on playtesting in Game Design Online, the counterpart to this. We do like a whole chunk on good methods for playtesting, things you should consider, how to find and foster a playtesting group. Worth a go. Discount code at the end of this seminar if you want to get it. Now, you can get a head start by getting good at stats and maths using simulations or using a points calculator. There's a fantastic tool that's available on itch at the moment called MacDie, which is Monte Carlo Dice Information Engine or something. It's made by a game designer called Jeff Engelstein, who is fantastic. I will drop a link in at the end. And it's basically it's very early days. It's made in Visual Basic. It's very plain, but it lets you simulate dice rolls, and it's very complex. You can figure out dice pools and exploding dice and all sorts of things. But you can do that. You can make a spreadsheet in Excel that works out points for you. Our Discord server often has a lot of chat about this sort of thing, but those are never a substitute for actual testing. They are always a starting point. I often will make a points calculator, which is basically a finger in the air, 20 points. And then you test from that point. And you get your testers to tell you, is that overpointed, underpointed? Is that thing too powerful, not powerful enough? So yeah, the answer, as ever, is design it, test it, change it. So in summary, this is a long section. War games have got cool miniatures and cinematic action, so balance kind of takes a back seat. But you can't ignore it. But most importantly, design your game first and don't worry about balance until you get deep into playtesting, because points and balance are a late consideration. It's better to have a compelling game than a balanced game. Designing mindfully. So, question here from Donnie. how can you convert a passion for rules theorizing and, oh, that's neat, I'll try to add that to the game, into actionable design work and progress? And then Dan also said, what would you say are the essential qualities to make a good game? Good questions, and I'm going to try to answer them now. So when I talk about mindful game design, what I'm talking about is trying to avoid autopilot. So trying to design a game trying to design a game in a way where you are conscious of every rule you're putting in, and you are aware that you're putting it in for the right reasons. You're not just including rules because it's the dumb thing. So the question is, how do you approach something as broad and sprawling as a miniatures game project? How do you lay that out in your mind and then also stay aware of those things as you're going through? It seems like an impossible task, but do not fear. I've got some answers for you, which is convenient because that's what I'm here for. So first of all, here's a little exercise that you can do with your game. So once you've kind of started designing your game, or even when you're at the design brief stage, here is a little way to think about the different systems in your game. Systems being, little groups of rules that interact together in a certain way. So there are kind of three levels I've got here. So you've got rules which are miniatures focused. They are things which directly affect what your miniatures on the table do. And they're the kind of rules that will happen in a round or in a turn, So they are things like, your units, profiles, stats, things that affect exactly what they can do on the table. How they're grouped. Are they individual? Are they squads? Are they squadrons? How they move around the table. How they interact with terrain, other miniatures, how they attack, defend, suffer damage, all that kind of stuff. And that is kind of the, where the bulk of your thematic rules writing will be. Step back from that is your what I call admin systems. So this is the stuff that holds the game together. So this is stuff you look at, in a game. So how do you assemble your force? How do you write an army list? Or how do you bring a force together to play a game? Is there, are there points values? Are you just picking 10 miniatures of any kind? How does a round of play work? So in the miniatures focus systems, you're looking at specifically what the miniatures do, but how do you order that? How long does the game last and how do you win? These are all things that are what I call admin systems. And then back from there, metagame systems. Not all games have these, but this is like in a campaign or in a league or tournament. How do you link games and scenarios together? Yeah. How do units progress or deteriorate? How does one game impact the next? So you can look at your game and kind of break down all of your rules into these three categories. And that will help you in a way which I'll come to in a moment. But this cuts two ways. This is kind of breaking a game into chunks that way. Now let's look this way. We've got 3 tiers of rules. So this is coming back a little bit to what Donnie was asking a minute ago. This is primary, secondary, and tertiary systems. And these are how vital those rules are to your gameplay. Primary systems are your game engine. You cannot remove these or the game stops working. If we were looking at Warhammer, Age of Sigmar, the 2-hit roll. If you take out the 2-hit roll, the game doesn't work. You'd have to include something else in its place. I'll come back to dice rolling a little bit though, and I think you could collapse the hit roll and wound roll into one thing, but that's a crackpot idea for later. But yeah, this is kind of unit profiles, round sequence, how units move, how units shoot. This is all stuff that it's split between that miniature space and admin stuff, but it's all important to the game. You need this for the game to work, otherwise it stops being the game. Secondary systems support that engine. If you remove them, the game still functions, but it's missing something. So you're getting a fragment of gameplay rather than a full game. So objectives, scenarios, army lists, game duration even, unit special rules, terrain. So you can still play the game. And maybe if you're learning the game, you might leave those out and just play, let's just put a couple of units on the table and just play a couple of turns and see what happens. Tertiary systems are the fun bit. They're the icing on the cake, the sprinkles. They are the extras that add detail. So these are things that you can play the game with and ignore, and probably a lot of the time you will ignore them because they're things that maybe you don't always use. They're things that experienced players bring in to get more variety. So night fighting, extra army lists, unique characters. When I say extra army lists, what I mean is for secondary systems, you really only need one army list, right? because you can play generic army one against itself, you know, two versions of the same army, but additional army lists are kind of tertiary. You don't need them for the game to function. So once you've kind of cut your game down into primary, secondary, tertiary, and then miniatures led, admin based, and metagame, you can then look at, if you can figure out how to do it, a bit of a process for designing your game. And this is the thing, again, we talk about this a lot in Game Design Online. We have a process for designing games, and it's all about breaking it down into manageable chunks, because trying to design a game is difficult. Trying to write a novel is difficult. Trying to compose, I don't know, a symphony is difficult. But you can start with one element. You know, you can write the first chapter of a novel, right? And if you can do that, you can keep on going. So let's apply that here. When we design games, we do it in 3 broad stages. And again, we go into more detail on this on Games Online. We go into quite a lot of detail of this on our website, on needycatgames.com. But test build is the first early stages, where you're just kind of playing around. You're not worrying too much about making the rules too firm. You're just getting a feel for what the game is. Mechanical draft is where you start writing things down and codifying your rules and starting to build out to a full game. And then the full draft, the third stage, is like where you start polishing it and refining it and, you know, adding in additional stuff. And that maps onto this quite nicely. So when you start off with your primary miniatures focused systems. So how do units move? How do they shoot? How do they fight? How do they interact with the table? How do they interact with each other? You know, all of those, how are they activated? That sort of stuff there. Then your primary admin systems come in on top of that. How does your round sequence work? So you're no longer just looking at how does one unit attack one other unit. How do 5 units on the table all interact? Who's going in which order? Do you have an initiative system? Is it like an I go, you go, back and forth? That is your test build. So you do that and you play around and you tinker until you've got something that works. Then you bring in the secondary miniatures focused systems. So you start maybe writing an army list. You start including some special rules. You start maybe bringing in the admin systems. You might start bringing in rules for objectives, you know, game length. And that builds your mechanical draft. You get a full, playable, simple version of your game. You do not add your tertiary systems or your metagame systems until that is solid as it can be. So, and again, we're not talking balance here, because really balance is a tertiary consideration. You work on that until your game is playable. You've figured out which parts you're abstracting, which parts you're simulating. It's smooth, it flows, it's fun. People want to play more of it. You test and test and test, and then you start gradually adding in those additional systems. Don't make the mistake that we see a lot of people make, which is they start designing a war game and immediately jump to writing 10 different army lists or a bunch of characters or whatever it might be. Focus on the core gameplay engine and work outwards from there. So, yeah, and then once you've kind of done that and you're in the process, then you want to start analyzing your design. So because you've broken it down, you'll already be quite mindful of what's going into it. But it's worth doing a checkpoint, you know, say once a month or whenever it is, you're going to stop and take stock of your game. You're going to look at each of your systems that you've included in the game, each of your sets of mechanics, and say, why does that rule exist and why does it work in the way that it does? What is it doing here and why? Ideally, your answer will be one of these things here. It's simulating an element of the theme. It's adding an interesting element to gameplay. It's something that players just really enjoy. You know, we've tested it and players really love this rule for some reason. It's something that makes the game intuitive and easy to learn. It's an obvious or popular choice. You know, all the games are doing this, or it's different from anything else that's out there. Watch those last two, though. If something is obvious and popular or different, but isn't one of those other things, there's a chance it might be a darling that needs murdering or something you've included without really thinking about it. But basically, look at all those things and ask yourself those questions. Your design brief can help here, because this isn't an easy process, but having that design brief that you made right at the very start can really help you to look at your game and go, right, what is my theme? You know, what do I want my players to be focusing on in the gameplay? Is this rule doing that? And if not, pop it out and see how it plays. You can get good at analyzing your designs by playing lots of games, not just war games, but go and play board games, video games, app games, look at sports, look at folk games, look at just any type of gaming. There will be things you can borrow, and the more well-read you are, the more analytical you can become. Also, help other people playtest their games. Again, if you come to the Discord server, we've got a whole room for people to, playtest stuff, and ask for playtesting and things. If you only ever play finished, polished, published games, it can be really disheartening to look at your own game, which is half finished, and think, oh, this is nowhere near as good as the games I've played before. If you've played other, games that are a work in progress, you'll get a feel for where your game should be. It's the equivalent of if you wanted to write books, getting hold of an unedited manuscript by an author is a great thing to have, because you see the difference that an editor has on a book, and you start feeling less bad about your own writing. Same thing here. You will see the difference that constant playtesting and rules review has, and you will feel better about your own work and be better suited to analyze your own work once you're used to playtesting other people's games. The most important thing is pay attention to the systems you add to your game and think carefully about them. Use your design brief, ask yourself lots of questions, play as many games as possible, not just war games, and do not worry about your tertiary systems until your primary and secondary stuff is solid.